Welcome to a series of 5 lectures on American exceptionalism and American identity, delivered at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Eugene, Oregon, in January and February of 2019. Well, here we are again. This will be somewhat different than the previous ones. We're down to here, rethinking American identity. I remind you that there's stuff at decob.org that you can find which amplifies or whatever, comments on stuff that I'm saying. Now, my strategy in these lectures will have worked if at some point when you're in a political argument, you say to somebody, wait a minute, are those the only alternatives? Or, I don't think that American identity works that way, or something like that. Basically, we're trying to get a position where we're not presented with only bad choices, where we're not being pushed into either or. Either you've got this solid, firm belief based on the scriptures or Ben Franklin or something, or you're floating in empty space. I'm trying to argue there's always in the middle. We did some work previously denying that any identity or social role or set of values is solid and substantial, immediately given. Because we don't have identities, roles, values, projects, the way a stone has weight and size. A value or role is not in us the way the stone's qualities are in it. There seems to be more space inside us. We have an attitude, we take a certain inner distance from our beliefs, our roles. And in a modern society, there's a room for that. You may have had that inner distance earlier, but there was no socially acceptable way to have it acknowledged and used as part of your identity. Now you can. So my argument in the first couple of lectures was, no identity is single ply, solid, nor is it single ply plus a second self-reflective single ply. It's a movement always between the two. Distances, spacings, and crossing of those distances. That was the first. Then last week, we looked from the other end and we said, modern identities are not purely empty, pure form without content. No way to turn, or all ways are just the same. And I used this diagram, imagining a self, which was just an empty processing device, gathering data, consulting preferences, deciding on a plan and executing it. Right? You can imagine a self. You could program a little computer to have a self like that. And if you look on a larger scale, think of a society like that gathers the data on the environment and the preferences, derives a group decision or preference, and implements it. But of course, to say that is hiding in enormous machinery. How do you gather data? How do you come to a social conclusion? Who decides the social preference? The dictator? The legislature? God? I mean, enormous issues there. But at the most abstract level, you could say a society is a device for gathering data and deriving a group preference. There could be, of course, evaluations, feedback loops, and so on. You could talk about legislatures. You could talk about markets. And if it was purely formal, this social machine, it wouldn't have any goal of its own. It would not have as a goal preserve the royal family or keep the hierarchy of nobles and peasants or strengthen the established church or anything like that. It would just be a machine. So normally, in history, a social machine, has had certain boundary conditions. Certain things are unacceptable. But you could imagine a purely formal machine which could take in whatever preferences you can. You can imagine that. You can imagine it, but you can't realize it. So think of these bureaucrats here as waiting for information about your preferences, about your decisions. And then I made the point that there's a problem. if those bureaucrats are working according to rules, there isn't any perfect set of rules, because no general description can capture all the infinite detail of any individual case. If you think my case is very simple. I ran through the red light. But there's an infinite number of circumstances and connections that could be brought to bear on that. From your feeling that day, your mother's sickness, what you had to sleep that night, and so on. And for a practical decision made by a social machine, there's no final rule telling us which of those infinite details are relevant to a decision. Because if you had a rule that listed 45 things that had to be taken into account, there'd be 45 more that might, on occasion, be relevant. And knowing when they are and when they aren't is not a matter of following a rule. So they've known for a long time that any set of rules has to have, they call equity courts or judges who decide, does this case fit under this rule? Was this a murder or was it self-defense? Things like that. Then we said a little bit last time about capitalism. Just because talking about modernity, you run into an easy equation with capitalism, that the formerly free universal system means a free market. Maybe, maybe not. And the free market equals capitalism, which is not true. Capitalism is just one way of arranging property relations in a free market. And formerly free modern individual is the capitalist dream of the individual who only thinks of economic value. Now, it's a liberation that you can think of economic value without also thinking of religion. That's a liberation. But it doesn't mean you only think about economic value. And I pointed out a couple of features of capitalism which are not formally free. There are people who come to the market owning things and other people who don't. Inequality there. There's no way to avoid the market because you can't produce your life on your own. You have to share. And there's a tendency of capitalism to produce monopolies because for corporates to grow profit, they have to get bigger. And there's various manipulations, lobbyists, people behind the curtain, and so on. So those are questions about non-formal features of the system. But the other point I made was there's a conceptual problem with the formal features of the system. A purely formal social mechanism cannot exist as purely formal. And there were two arguments I used last time, one from Wittgenstein and one from Hegel. Wittgenstein showed us a diagram of a machine, could be a teeter-totter, any machine like that, where you do something to the thing on the wheel and the thing moves. And then he said, of course you look at the diagram and you say, yes, you pull this and that will move. But wait, what if the machine was made of dough? It bent around in various ways. Then the picture would not help you in understanding what would happen when you move the wheel. You have a picture of a teeter-totter, you say, oh, you put a kid on this end, it's going to go like this. But what if it doesn't? Maybe it melts or it just bends in the middle. Right? Which is to say, what a formally described machine does depends on what it's made of. No great surprise there. It'll work the way the diagram suggests if it has the right qualities. But you can't get an exhaustive list of those qualities for the reasons I mentioned before. You can't find a rule that will specify all the things you have to do. That's why being an engineer or being an architect is hard, because you can't just apply a rule. You have to say, okay, I need a wall that will do this. Which kind of material will do it? But the temperatures here are more extreme, and there's the wind. There's always factors that you have to add in. It can't be done perfectly. But of course, what we're mostly interested in is not building walls, but building social systems. But it's that way too. A formally described social system will depend on the people, the climate, the resources, the languages, the habits, the history that it's embodied in. Here's a beautiful economic thing. Capital flows in various ways. But each one of these little flows depends on people with histories and bodies and preferences. Or here, This is a constitutional arrangement. Again, who's in it? What's their history? The machine won't work except through actual people, and actual people always have more qualities about them than the machine description provides, and that will influence them. Hegel makes a similar argument. And I use the example of mobility. Let's say you want to talk about animals being mobile. Well, you can walk, slither, glide, swim, burrow, flop, whatever. If you're walking, you can have feet or hoofs or pads or claws. You can have big soft feet or very hard feet. And each of those details changes what you can do. If you're a horse, you can't climb trees. Right? If you're a spider, you have a lot of legs. But you can't do what a kangaroo can do. And the little dog that can run along the grass and the kangaroo can jump over it have different qualities in different environments. So take a system, a mobile animal, embody it in one way, a whole environment, a whole network is created. Embody it another way, a different environment, a different network is created. Right? It's not just a tiger is mobile and it has legs. It's mobile because and through the fact that it has legs. Legs of a particular kind. Legs which allow it to do this and forbid it from doing that. Well, so too, if you create a social system and you're going to have people in it, they're going to have certain qualities which will push them in one way or another. Right? A repertory of skills, instincts, reactions on the social level too. Embodiment brings a particular identity that opens and limits who you are, what projects you're already engaged in, and your possibilities for action. That already is important. When you come into the world, naked as it were, you already have a bunch of DNA that puts you in a certain direction, a body which is formed for certain things, a language that you learn which gives you certain structure, and you're involved in ongoing projects of your family, your culture, and so on, before you have a chance to sign up for them. Right? Now, you may want to change those, but you're starting from them. It's already opening some possibilities and more or less closing others. So the formal freedom, the floating free, just never happens. Any identity, any social role will only exist with and through contingent detail. And it'll affect the style of processing, the way it follows its rules. They don't do it the same in Germany and in Japan. It's shaped by contingent details that may differ from place to place, maybe not greatly, maybe very greatly. I'm just saying it always has to be there. We never start from zero. Now add in the fact that we're aware of all this. We're sort of, oh, yeah, I'm self-aware, I'm a little bit ironic about it. How do you live that? And then at the end of the class I said, well, let's try learning from an extreme case. Fan fiction. Fanfiction.net, if you look at it, is amazing. Novels, movies, all that. These different titles, people have written things extending their universes. They like them. Here's some examples. I quoted that last time. People playing with Mr. Darcy or with Hamlet. Here's people doing Harry Potter, costume, cosplay. Here's people going to a Jane Austen convention. All right? They've paid money to get dressed up as Regency people. All right? Now the point is they're not creating these roles out of thin air. They're taking up a set of rules, a set of stories, and changing them. They like the world of Jane Austen. They want more of it. Of course, they're idealizing it. They want to fill it out. They want maybe to change some things. They've written novels, for instance, about Jane Austen herself getting married. Self-conscious creation within the rules that are given and decreed. Creatively bending and amending them. Doesn't that sound familiar? These people are doing this as an escape. It's a really boring job. But on weekends, I go to Jane Austen's world. Yeah, but their way of inhabiting the world may be what we need. I deal with our world, fill it out, revise it. That sort of self-conscious, creative work is what we're already doing in our world and what we need to learn to do with our identity. So we need to do it better. And we need to do it together. And that's hard. There's an example I used in the last class. Some Star Wars people meeting some Civil War reenactors. Right? Collision of culture. All very self-conscious. But the general lesson is we're never empty. We're always already involved. We're already moving in a direction. We're already speaking a language with particular talents and directions we didn't choose, but define us. But on the other hand, there's always that inner distance, that possibility, because we're not concretely identified with all this. And each of these comes to be through the other. The inner distance is potentiated by the fact that we have the given identity. The given identity comes into our consciousness through the inner distance. So change and reform is always possible, and we're never starting from zero with nothing given and no directions favored. Always in a meaningful context we didn't create. I'm going to pursue that idea a little bit. Now we're moving into new material. Before I do, any questions about this? It's all pellucid, I know, so clear. How can you object? Wait and see. Think about this. The context alters meaning. Even if we keep the words the same, or the roles, or the values, or the social structure. No change, but we alter the context. Think about putting on a play and shifting the background scenery. People say exactly the same things, but the background scenery in one case was a forest, and the next case is some science fiction-y thing, and the next case is a jungle, and the next case is the inside of a rich house. The words, even though they're identical that the actors perform, are going to be affected by that change in the background. Let's take some examples. Hamlet, famous. Imagine, of course, the people do it in different ways, but imagine that we keep Hamlet just the same, perform it. Or take the Bible. There we have words that people work very hard to keep the same, though in fact they interpret them differently over time. Or think about American individualism, John Wayne, right? Or think about American patriotism. So there's 4 items which we try to keep constant. The meaning of the Hamlet, the Bible, John Wayne. And now let's put them into the context of the railroad. All right? Now Hamlet means something different when you put it in a world that has railroads that connect you out far more than Hamlet could ever have traveled in the world of the play. And you know that, so you feel that the play feels more constrained in a world with railroads. And the Bible feels a little different because you're no longer in a tightly knit community. And individuality seems to have a wider field with railroads. And patriotism now takes on a different field because it can reach way out. Here's another example, China. Put Hamlet in the context of a world where the Chinese are running into you all the time. And suddenly the context shifts again. And although the words of Hamlet may be the same, it's bringing up different echoes. And the Bible now just looks like one sacred book among many. And John Wayne doesn't very well fit on the Chinese plane, so you're not sure what to make about our kind of individualism versus somebody else. The contrast develops because the context has changed. And patriotism now gets into issues of rivalry and issues of makes you worry somewhat. Now, here's another example, feminism. Think about Hamlet now in a feminist context. The way they treat Ophelia suddenly begins to come up. Right? Or the Bible, all sorts of things look awful from a feminist context. Even though you may not believe in feminism, these things suddenly become salient. You suddenly say, oh, I have to think about that. John Wayne suddenly doesn't look so good either. And American patriotism suddenly could look kind of oppressive in many of its forms. Well, think about it all in the context of atomic war, but let's forget that, our context. Climate change. And you say Hamlet has no difference in climate change. True, but putting it on in the situation where the world is threatened, in the way in which Hamlet's kingdom is threatened by the outside force of Fortinbras, may suddenly have a different echo. And the Bible suddenly looks either very good or very bad, depending how you take the idea of caring for the world. And John Wayne looks like he's been forgetting a lot of things in the context of it. And American patriotism doesn't know where to turn. So those are examples of meaning that's changed because the context changes. Even if you're working very hard to keep the symbols or the words identical, they keep moving around. And then, of course, you're teaching your kids that at the same time. So they're not learning it with the same context you did. So it's going to change just, even though you try to keep the words the same, it's going to alter. It's always in a meaningful context you didn't create, which changes some meanings and alters possibilities. Okay, keep that in mind because now we move on. There are notions of American exceptionalism that say, that's all hooey. We do start from zero. We have an empty field. We're unique. Right? Here's an example. This is a quote from a New York Review of Books essay about a couple of books about American exceptionalism. This is a quote from the review. According to the exceptionalist creed, embraced by both political parties and the press, imperialism is a European thing, seizing territory, extracting their resources from the dark. But we the Americans, we don't do that. We bestow self-determination on backward people. Notice the whole theory of modernization there. Backward people who yearn for it secretly. They don't know they yearn for it, but we'll tell them they do. Right? Here's an example to try and flesh this out. Think about the US and France. In the end of the 18th century, we had our revolution, and we proclaimed Declaration of Independence type stuff. And a little bit later, the French proclaimed the rights of man, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And you look at them, they're almost identical. They both stem from certain Enlightenment theories about government and so on. Not much difference. So we're both preaching a revolutionary gospel to the world. But there may be a difference between us. The French probably think of themselves as having a particular French culture, and when they descend upon some African country and Frenchify it, they're giving them the glory of French culture. Right? They're bringing them into, they're adding a positive thing to them. Whereas the Americans tend to think of themselves, perhaps, as sort of degree zero, pure individuals. We're what you get when you take away culture, not when you add it. Right? Now, I'm not saying we all think that way, but there is a theme of American exceptionalism which thinks that way. Arrive at Ellis Island, drop your baggage. You're Americans now. Change your name. Forget all that stuff you carried from the old country. Right? Leave it aside. Feel free. Go in there. Make your fortune. Or not. But in any case, leave that old country aristocratic baggage behind. That's an image that we treasure. But the presupposition of that image is that somehow being American is sort of open and free in a way that being French is not. Right? American individuals are what you get when you take away culture and tradition. Is this true? No. It does fit the purely formal myth that modernity means we've stripped away tradition and now you're just free, empty, ready to move. It also fits the Homo economicus myth that we just take our economic values and measure them and go. But no. No, for two reasons. If what I've said is true, it's impossible. You're never empty like that, right? I've just been talking about all that. And secondly, we're always on the road in multiple projects, not just one, in uncontrolled context. So that's what I've been arguing. But there's another reason. The story about us being pure and empty just doesn't fit the facts, right? And now we're turning to the facts about American identity. Nobody arrives here naked. Not the first people, nor the second. Nation of immigrants. And there's really no unity in the family. There's no baggage. There's baggage you can't drop. Your language, your basic culture, your physical environment, your habits. You don't drop them. You may modify them over time, but they don't go away. This is a map from 9 Nations by Joel Garrow in 1981. It's a map trying to show different parts of America and what they do. It's interesting, but this is a better map. From Colin Woodward's book about 11 nations in America, 2012. Now this is worth pausing over. This is his particular theory. It looks like this. His basic claim is the different early American colonies were founded by different people with different purposes, and they didn't get along very well. You've got French peasants being brought into New France on the top and the bottom. You've got Barbados planters, people who already were into slavery, raising sugar, right, and had very cruel habits. English aristocrats in Virginia who basically wanted to be aristocrats with a subservient peasant population and started out with indentured white people and eventually proved economically more efficient to use black slaves. But their treatment of slaves was different than the Georgia people. And then you have, from the top again, English Puritan religious cultists coming into New England. Very strict, trying to get out from under the king, sure, but also being, you will not be Catholic. You will obey these rules. We will all have a town meeting and we'll all get together, but there are edges here and don't walk off them. Then there's the Dutch merchants who founded New York, who were into it for corporates and profits. And then there's the middle part, the English Quakers and Catholics, somewhat persecuted people who are founding a more open, tolerant society. Not so tolerant in the beginning, but got more so. And then there's a middle part of a lot of losers in the Irish and Scots situation who eventually became the Appalachians. So he's claiming that, look, you've got people who had religious, non-religious, economic, different economic things. They're all there for different reasons and different purposes. And that's historical, that's true. Then his claim is, over time, those different cultures continue. And the reason they spread is to do with migration. And you see the Yankee people have a chunk of the Midwest, and over here us too. And the Midlands, the more tolerant types, they have a sort of chunk of the Midwest. And Appalachians have another part. I mean, whether his historical story is fully true, the point he's making is there isn't any one American identity. There are many. They gradually come together, but they don't start out the same. Has anybody read that book? No, only one or two people. It's very good. Once you get to the Civil War, which of course ties right into this, I'm never convinced fully that the stuff carries on the way he says it does. But it's very interesting. I mean, of course, you have what he calls El Norte. These are Mexicans very, very far away from the central power in Mexico, way up north, kind of out on the frontier. I mean, you think of them as southern Spanish, but actually, from their point of view, they were the northern extreme, and they were kind of ignored by the central government in the Spanish. So they have their own culture again. So his point is the Americans' overall identity gets hammered out amid conflict. It's a work in progress, since before the revolution and after the revolution. So the myth that all the founders of America had this one idea, and they held hands and said, let's get away from the king. Not so easy. In fact, the different groups got away from the king in different ways at different times. And they fought. Now, I have an example to consider here. There wasn't in the beginning, and there isn't now, any obvious single thing to call American identity. But there is a kind of American overall identity that's been hammered out. Here's my example. Me. 100% says 23andMe. I'm a perfect immigrant, the one they would want, right? Mostly from Northern Europe, Britain and Ireland, with a mixture of German. How could you? Southern Germany, as a matter of fact. Northern Ireland. That's me. I'm the kind of white immigrant you would want. But when my mother in the 1930s went to get a job teaching, she couldn't get the job she wanted because she was Catholic in Pennsylvania. So she had to take a job in a coal mining town further south, much less prestigious job. And in the 50s, when my father wanted to play golf in the suburb of New York where we lived, he couldn't get into the main golf club because he was Catholic. He had to go to a different one. Now that's hardly big-time discrimination. It's very mild. Nothing at all. But it was there. Right? And the point I'm making is being white, being American, is a construct that was changing as I grew up. Right? Suddenly, by the time I'm voting in 1960, when Kennedy gets elected, being Catholic is no longer being outside the fold. Right? Here is something from 1891. If immigration is properly restricted, you'd no longer be troubled with anarchy, socialism, the mafia. Right? After he resigned from the Supreme Court in 1880, Justice William Strong became president of the National Association to secure religious amendment of the Constitution to stop the influx of Catholic and Jewish immigrants. Right? That was going on. It wouldn't happen now. I mean, well, there's some people who would like it to happen now. But things have gotten better. You know, I was a Mick. I'm in New York, right? There's the Micks, the Wops, the Kikes, right? All of that. You're not just an American. You're not just Irish. You're a Mick. I had a colleague when I was teaching at Fordham who would go to Buffalo, New York on weekends and pick up anti-Polish jokes and bring them to New York and change them into anti-Italian jokes. And he did very well. Right? And there's all this joshing going on. But there's also an underlying pushing of difference there. Yeah. So, I think you'll agree that that identity is changing over time. The, quote, white group gets bigger. Hispanics are not quite in it, but they may come in, depends on that. Italians are sort of in now. Jews are in it most of the time. You know, Catholics, they have no problem. I mean, but it was a problem 100 years ago. So something is changing. You know, we'd like to see it keep changing. Yep. So what I'm going to suggest is there's no single solitary single-ply identity, and there's too much diversity in the country. So maybe American identity should be found up on the second level, the way Roman citizenship did. Remember when we talked about St. Paul? St. Paul was accused by Jewish and Christian groups, and he was going to get handed over to them and punished. He said, I appeal to Rome, because he was a Roman citizen. And in effect, if you were a Roman citizen, you had, as it were, two identities. You had the identity as a citizen of Tarsus, the city he grew up in, or your religious community, and the Roman, which was sort of a generic umbrella over everybody. It had its own rituals, it had its own demands, but it was socially structured, but not as tightly so, and it could be appealed to. That's appealing, but it's more complicated. Roman citizenship pretty much ignored the details of the various cities. If you're a Roman, you just did Roman things. You also did your local stuff, but they didn't interfere much with one another. But an American second-level identity seems to be very much about dealing with or around diverse first-level identities, preserving them, protecting them, changing them, mutating them, demanding equal time for them, and so on and so on and so on. That's the Supreme Court building. That's the Pantheon in Rome. It's not accidental that they look similar. Right? Because they're both claiming to be on the level that you make the decisions about the lower level identity. And then you might say, wait, isn't America about denying and escaping? You know? I'm in Ellis Island, drop my baggage. Well, yes. But remember that denying or escaping something doesn't mean it goes away. If you're trying to escape your Italian identity, you've got to be alert all the time because it's creeping up on you. You know? You have to be careful not to eat the right food. You've got to stop, get rid of that accent when you talk. It doesn't go away. It's a familiar that you have to deal with. So what I'm suggesting is that the American self exists as a kind of motion which separates and unites this more general level, which we'll try to describe more, and the more particular identities which you are born with. And that means one level is more general, one's more particular. There are principles and values, we'll try to spell them out, practices, styles of action, styles of dialogue, ways of presenting yourself. And as you go down this list, there's more variation. The principles may be pretty much shared. The styles of action and dialogue may be quite different in New York, say, versus Chicago versus Oregon. So it's a two-level identity. And it's a two-level identity with a variation within it. And those attitudes and those principles are not just abstract, they're in institutions, courts, tokens and rituals for mutual recognition. Right? Remember Hegel's point that you come to know yourself by being recognized by somebody else whom you recognize as a full person. It's that mutual, I recognize you, you recognize me. Now we both feel confirmed in our identity. Right? And that's not abstract. It happens through particular rituals, particular tokens. Right? Which means that the solidity we live in may be porous. Attempts to manufacture or enforce single-ply identities are looking away from all that complexity, hiding it. You can't get rid of that complexity. That's who you are. But you can pretend it isn't there. The inner possibility of distance, change, is always there. Even if you don't intend it to change, as I said before, the context changes, the meanings begin to change. All right. All right, let's just stop there for a second. I'll go back to you. So what I'm giving you is a formula for American identity. I mean, it didn't content in it, but a formula that we should think, it isn't like, I am an American is the same thing as I'm 5'2", right? Because the identity is involved in this inner distance. It's involved in a two-level thing with general principles and particular given identities, each of which influences the other. But wait, problem. That's the description of the modern self, isn't it? I've argued that earlier. What's so much American about it? It's what modern self is. We've got institutionalized self-reflection, institutionalized ability to separate yourself from fixed identities, which you have a place for now, people to do that. Well, what's so special about that? What makes it American? Well, we claim to be the first. Is that enough? No. We've admitted modernity can't be purely formal. So if there are other modern nations, and surprise, there are, they will have their own kind or style or start of modernity. So what's the special American kind of being modern? That's what we're up to now, okay? By the way, are nations the proper unit to speak of here? A good question. We'll come back to that in the fifth lecture. Is there a particular way to be modern, a sort of family resemblance of ways to be modern, with a particular American style? Yes. All right, guys. What is it? No surprises, but keep in mind we're not describing a single-ply fixed identity. Here's the first clue. Huck Finn. Why, you ask, Huck Finn? I'll tell you why. This is the very last words of the novel. I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest. That's Oklahoma. Because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. The end, yours truly, Huck Finn. Escape. Think of all the stories about people escaping into the wild to get rid of escape from the constraints of an identity. Here's some pictures of various people who put Huck Finn together. Now, there's other people in the novel, and I want to zero in on one particular set. Here's a good diagram. There's Huck. There's his father, who abuses him. There's the widow, Douglas, his guardian, who tries to make him a religious kid. There's Miss Watson, the widow's sister, who does the same thing, only in a more negative way. There's Jim, the runaway slave, whom he gets involved in on the raft. There's Tom Sawyer, his companion. And there's the Duke and King, or two con men, who are on the raft for a time and almost turn them in and mess everything up. Now, what interests me about this is that there's two groups of people here. Pap, Miss, Widow, and even Tom Sawyer are within the standards of the day. Tom's manipulative role is, smart aleck kid. That's an acceptable role. But Huck and Jim, the Duke and the King, they spurn the standards of the day. They're doing something different. Huck is the innocent boy who's growing into a virtuous man, free from local prejudice. He finally admits to himself he's doing the right thing to help Jim. He's freeing himself and helping others. On the other hand, the Duke and the King are scheming con men who are freed from local values, the way Huck is becoming, but purely for selfish reasons to profit themselves. Right. So you have Huck and Jim versus the Duke and the King. One moves towards exploitation, selfishness, and conflict. The other moves toward openness and freedom and association. Okay, that, I argue, is a very typical American value set. Virtue versus greed. We use this polarity a lot to judge people, to judge policy, and to structure political choices. Who's the good guy? Who's moving towards community? Who's being selfish? And that's not the only thing, but that's a value duality that we use a lot. You think I'm right about that? Yes. It seems to me you look at it, one of our first instincts when you look at a social situation or political thing is, who's good and who's bad here? Who's selfish and who's community oriented? Well, that's one bit of content for that higher level set of values. Here's another, America the Beautiful, the song, okay? It was written by someone 33 years old, an English professor at Wellesley College, who had gone to Colorado Springs to teach for a summer school. I went to Colorado Springs one time to evaluate a department, very interesting place at Colorado College, very strange college, but good. They have a very different kind of academic schedule, one course at a time. They call it the block system. Each course takes 6 weeks and you do nothing but. Well, they had to modify it a bit because language labs you have to add in. Anyway, on her way, she visited the Columbian exhibition in Chicago, the so-called White City. And she went through Kansas on the train and she climbed Pikes Peak. When she got up to the top of Pikes Peak, she had some ideas for the poem. She wrote it. It was published a couple of years later. First published in 1895, revised in 1904 and 1911. You don't really see the earlier versions, But here they are from Wikipedia. I've boxed where some of the changes are. Now I'm going to take certain themes from this and ask you the similar. Do you think this is really touching on American identity? Let's start with this. Spacious sky, land, open space, wide horizon, always room for you to move out for new possibilities. And that's certainly part of the American myth, the American identity, I think. Would you agree? Yeah. Notice, by the way, that spacious skies is better than halcyon skies, which he started with. And the enameled plane isn't so good, but the fruited plane is better. Right. There is a problem, though, whether we still have that room for new possibility. The closing of the frontier, as people say. Right. Here's another one. The land of immigrants, the land of hope. Pilgrim feet, a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. Certainly that's, again, part of our image, that we're open, that we're welcoming. Well, not right now, but most of the time. Right. There is a minor problem that the wilderness was never empty, but we don't see that. And it was empty because we killed them all off. Right. But the immigrants introduce an issue that we have to think about. That there are people worried about purity, contamination, weakening, dilution of American. That presupposes some kind of fixed identity, single ply. That if you put in this Italian thing, it's going to melt it. Oh, why? It won't be anybody. But if you have this double-level notion of identity, that doesn't happen. The inner distances and the movements allow for mixtures. And that's, of course, what Lecture 5 is going to be about. Multiculturalism, how do we live in that? Here's another one. Crown thy good with brotherhood. The first version, it wasn't so good. Souls wax fair as earth and air, amusing heart at sea. But crowning good with brotherhood sounds good. But keep that in mind. Good is crowned with brotherhood, not selfishness. This is the same thing as in the Huck Finn. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Liberty and law are meant to go together. Thought we were escaping that, but no, that's part of what it means to be American, is somehow to put together liberty and law. Till selfish gain no longer stain the banner of the free, the first version said. Till all success be nobleness and every gain divine, the third version said. Self versus noble. Gain, profit, becoming divine, open. That's another set of values. Till nobler men keep once again thy whiter jubilee and crown thy good with brotherhood. Right? So you can see the emphasis in the song, especially when you look at the earlier versions, is selfishness versus community orientation. What about the whiter jubilee? You think that racism? Probably not. It probably refers to the white city. This was the Chicago exhibition that she went to see on her trip. The buildings were all white. Only one or two of them are left. This one here, that's now the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The last thing, this was at Jackson Park in Chicago. Ann and I lived just across the street from it. But there was this huge thing. It was all white. It was lit up electrically. It was a vision of the future. So that's probably what she's referring to with the whiter jubilee. But what about all this other stuff? Robber barons of the Middle Ages and the robber barons of today. The song was written during the first Gilded Age. We could have a third set now. We are now living in the second Gilded Age. So this stuff from the song, Gilded Age, when there's an enormous disparity of income, to income disparity. There's a cartoon from that time. Right? To people taking from other people. And that's another element we have to put in. Fairness for all social agents. We just finished with America the Beautiful and Huck Finn. And a lot of it has come down to this notion of no selfish gain, fairness. We're looking for some principles that would be sort of second-level principles that a, quote, American identity would hold. You see what I'm doing with the notion of American exceptionalism is saying, well, it's just one version of a modern identity with some peculiar American twist, but not all that different from other modern identities. And what's unique here, at least the way it's put, is that you'd have to be fair to all the social actors, individuals, but also families and groups and communities. And that's not easy, but that's a sort of ideal. Especially because we do have this thing about individualism. We seem to think that's more important than group identity. But in fact, we're always trying to balance both. I want to make a note here with relation to Japan, because I wrote an essay in 1984 about American individualism for a Japanese audience when I was teaching over there, which I put on the website. I wouldn't say now some of the things I said then, but it's not bad. But one of the points of the essay is, I mean, the standard thing is to say, well, Americans are individual-oriented, Japanese are group-oriented. And I wanted to squash that. And I wanted to squash the idea that the Americans were empty individuals. And I wanted to push the idea that individualism is a social product. I did all that. But I don't think the way I formulated the American identity is quite adequate the way I did it there. It's better now. But in any case, it's an interesting essay, arguing that we have myths about the self-rugged individual, and we think they have a myth about the group. And it's somewhat true, but it's much more complicated than that. In some ways, they're more individualistic than we are. In some ways, we're more group-oriented than they are. It's not easy. In any case, there's an issue lurking beneath the surface here. Fairness versus equality. Fairness, or call it justice, means you treat equal cases the same way. Of course, when is a case the same as another case? That gets you into that bureaucratic problem of, are there exceptional issues in this case which make it not equal? They look the same, but they're not. That's always a matter of judgment. Aristotle says somewhere, you can't use arithmetical equality. It would be like saying everyone should have the same diet. But Milo is a bodybuilder. He needs more food than Aristocles over here. Right? You tailor the diet to the needs of the body. You tailor the demands to the mental and social abilities and so on. So whatever equality means, it's going to be tricky. Equality of opportunity, equality of result. And this is where a debate, of course, is going on constantly. Well, trying to give some content to this notion of equality, Robert Reich, remember him? Short fellow who was the Secretary of Labor. He would come and talk and standing on a box. This is a quote from the beginning of an article he wrote. America does have a norm, a common set of norms. They aren't written down in the Constitution. They're unwritten standards that define who we are and what we believe in, based on responses to polls. What polls, he doesn't say. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, the majority of them, have consistently agreed to 5 simple principles, the American social contract. So this is his claim to give more content than I've given so far. And I'm very curious about your reaction to them. We'll take them one by one, and whatever you think of that, we'll then go on to something even more outre. There they are. First, everyone should have an equal chance to get ahead. A little vague what get ahead means. But yeah. Anybody want to disagree with that? Define it? No one should be discriminated against because of race, religion, gender, or sexual preference. We know there are people who want to deny that. But by and large, the situation is now that if you want to deny it, you feel a little funny doing it, and you do it in secret. unless you're the president. Now, the third one is a little more controversial. No one who works full-time should have to live in poverty. You can agree with it. Do you think the majority of Americans would agree with it?
They don't pass minimum wage.
Opinion? Yeah. In the back.
I think, in a vague way, most people would agree with it, but they don't agree with the steps that would be necessary to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
For example, raising the minimum wage.
Yeah. It's a nice ideal, but it's just not practical, sorry. That kind of view? Yeah. Sure, I'll sign on to it, but just don't make me pay for it.
I guess this would be part of the first one. Everyone should have an equal chance to get ahead. I've thought at times that one of the unwritten rights that we absolutely believe in is that everyone has a right to make money.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter whether what that person is doing is helpful, such as selling arms to the Middle East or what have you. If it will make money for you, you've got a right to do it.
Yeah. Getting ahead anyhow, there may be some feeling against that. Yeah. But also, you're sort of proud of people who do it.
Well, on the first principle about everyone having an equal chance to get ahead, so that's sort of why we have affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you discriminate in favor of somebody, you are automatically discriminating against somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So that, if you allow special points for people getting admitted into medical school, say, then people who have equal scores or better don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
So that
The problem of a zero-sum situation, yes. Yeah.
I think part of the problem with the
Speak into it, Ron.
part of the problem with the third one is that comes in conflict with the interest of corporations to maximize their profits, and that the corporations tend to be the ones that have the money to get political campaigns.
Every corporation has the right to get ahead, right?
Yeah. Because corporations are people, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think the corporations are part of it, but I think we have institutionalized what type of work has value.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so we've accepted that certain jobs aren't worth as much as other jobs.
Works full-time. There's one group of people who work full-time and don't get paid at all. Mothers.
Thank you.
So, yeah, if you really took that principle seriously, it could demand a lot of changes.
One of the things that they suggest is giving everybody a living wage or a supplement,
Mm-hmm.
and then everyone would be able to live. If somebody's unemployed, they supplement them.
Mm-hmm.
And normally the objection is that it would cost money, but the unemployment, the social services, all the things that people need to supplement that could be offset.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of research that says that you could if you paid people.
Mm-hmm. That's the so-called universal basic income. It's an idea that's getting more popular. You get rid of a lot of welfare programs and you simply give everybody, it's kind of like Social Security, everybody gets a certain basic income, whether they work or not. And there's many debates about it, but it's on the table in a way it never was before.
I think looking at number one, and the problems start with number one, this could be a basis for free public education. That education is the right. We say, even if you're an immigrant kid, you came across, you show up, Texas, famous case, you sit in the desk, you get the same income. However, as I believe it was Trump Jr. and his daddy's party said, my father wants to give everyone the same chance we did, so you could school if you so choose. Or, it begins to break down along the lines of education, which is something we were very proud to have, was the public education system. But public education in Beverly Hills is maybe different than public education in Chicago. And the idea of, number 3, choice. Also, we say people are free to make bad choices. If you choose to drop out at 16 or take opiates, then you get to pay the price. And Calvinism, as part of our founding principle, whether or not you were destined to be poor equals bad, and wealthy equals good. So we have some issues that complicate.
Yes, and if you look at number 4, people should take responsibility for themselves and their family and deserve help if they need it through no fault of their own. But if it is through their own fault, you made bad choices, well, tough. That is a kind of an American attitude. There's winners. You do the right thing, you deserve it. You do the wrong thing, well, you're a loser. That's a less attractive idea, but I think that's implicit in here.
I could just add to that idea number 4, one of the baser things that I have come to understand in the minds of some people who are very against social services for people who are in need is that if you were going to get yourself into a position where you could not pay for your family, what are you doing with the family? And that whole idea is one thing that I've seen run through articles and suggested, not often spoken, but being it's almost, what did you think? What were you thinking when you had children?
Of course, they're there now. Yeah. Yes. So what interests me about these are positive ideas, you can sort of say yes, but number 4 introduces some shady things. Number 5, we would tend to agree with. No one should have special privileges and power based on wealth or class. But we do. There's all these studies lately about the wealthy passing things on. I got into Harvard, my children will get into Harvard, yours won't. I can pay for my kids' violin lessons. I deserve to because I have all this money. If you're really going to push 5, you should have no inheritances. You should have big death duties like they did in England at the time. Big. You can accumulate all the money you want in your life if you're a good entrepreneur, but you can't pass it on to your children. So they will start. You'd have to have some sort of basic income to qualify for that. And anyway, so you see what I mean, that I think these principles are probably true in the sense that you could get a lot of people to sign on to them. But could you get people to sign on to the ways that would be implied by them to make them happen? Or would they reinterpret them in various ways? That's the nature of this sort of 2-level identity. The second level is general, and it can produce this kind of debate. And it's always going to be embodied. Whatever you do to make these things happen, they're going to be embodied in particular people, in particular systems, in particular historical circumstances. Right? I'm going to go one step further. This may be too much for you. Walt Whitman. This is the preface to Leaves of Grass, 1855, the edition just before the Civil War. He later on had other editions. How's this for a statement of principles Americans would have? I'll spread them out. Love the earth and the sun and the animals. Sure. Despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks. Stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your income and your labor to others. He was, as you know, at this time a newspaper editor in Brooklyn. Hate tyrants. Oh yeah, we love that. Argue not concerning God. Reaction in the back. Question?
No, just saying, yeah.
Have patience and indulgence toward the people. Take off your hat to nothing, known or unknown, or to any man or number of men. Go freely with the powerful, uneducated person, and with the young and with the mothers of families. Re-examine all you've been told in school or church or in any book, and dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem. What do you think about that as a statement of general principle? It's not a value rule exactly, but it's a kind of maxim, things you could say to yourself. And that seems American in a way that you wouldn't say it isn't quite French. No, it's not quite British even. No. I expected people to bridle at this, but you're not.
I was going to say on that last line, and your very flesh shall be a great poem. If you could do all of that, you could leave this earth very gracefully, and your soul would be very happy.
Yes. Now, shortly after this, the war broke out, and Whitman worked during the war as an orderly in ambulance and hospital work all through the war. So he lived up to it.
On the take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, to any man or any number of men, he forgot to say that you don't have to stand during the Star-Spangled Banner.
Yes, that's true.
So, you know, I hate to throw cold water on this, but if I really lived like this in America today, I'd be on the street corner in rags. I'm sorry.
Especially because of the despised riches and give everything away. Yeah.
Give away all my income.
Yep.
But what insults your soul might not, we might have very different insults. And what insults my soul could be very revolting to you, and vice versa. So I mean,
Oh, I'm not saying these aren't good ideals. I'm saying if I truly lived them to the ultimate in today's society, I would have nothing.
This sounds
Couple of hands.
This sounds very Christ-like to me. I mean, isn't this what the New Testament says?
Yeah. Walt Whitman would have been astonished to be compared to Christ.
I'm still back on your first point with Robert Wright. So you don't have to go back to it, but his first point was equal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the words matter. Here at the last point, they talk about re-examine all you've been told. They don't really mean all you've been told. There needs to be a lot of asterisks if you simply apply these words. Because they don't mean all. You speak a language, and we're going to start with the sound of ooh, and then how are we going to make that? So all isn't the word. Robert Reich's first thing was equal. If you replaced equal with fair, it would be more of a understanding that he doesn't mean true equality, because people have different innate abilities and situations. So if I had fair, you'd automatically know there's an asterisk there. And isn't this the same way? Hate tyrants. Well, there was a philosophy in Rome that you had a benevolent tyrant. And that went on for several generations as to whether or not it was true. To give alms to everyone that asks. Well, we have situations where people are on the way into a liquor store, and how much do you want to contribute?
Yeah.
I don't think that's, you need an asterisk, and that's a problem with these kind of statements.
Yeah, once they're embodied, you get into all of that.
And I want to know if words have meaning, and that's because I attended your earlier lectures, so I'm trying to understand where the words actually take us. We're not fixed by the words.
No.
Well, the ideal of let's see, devote your income and labor to others. Of course, yeah, Jesus said if you have 2 clothes, give one to the person who has none. There are millions of people that go to church in this country every day, and none of them do that.
No.
Not to that ideal.
No, this is...
But this is still, I mean, I think that it could be taken as devote much of your income or...
Yeah, once you take this and try to embody it in concrete circumstances, the asterisks are going to start appearing. You're going to have to qualify it in various ways, certainly.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you would know. I'm a little confused reason we're concerned about that phrase, go freely with powerful,
Mhm.
uneducated persons. Do you know what he means by that?
He was very fond of working men. I think that's what he's
So
referring.
that's what he's,
Yeah.
okay.
If you, of course, if you gave away all your money and your alms to everyone that asked, if you alone did that, you would not be able to survive.
That's right.
But if everyone did that, everyone would survive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, but
I have a question about questioning everything you've been told in school or church, and yet not arguing about God.
Mhm.
Is the not concerning God, is that just because it's futile? Because
I think that's what he's saying. He's sort of on Emerson's side of God and nature being one.
This is all well and good. What's this got to do with American exceptionalism?
Well, you see what I'm trying to do is to take the notion of American exceptionalism and tame it. Say it's just a variety of modern life. And it's influenced by notions of fairness and equality, which are perhaps somewhat unique to us because we had this sense of wide open frontiers. And that gives it a different twist than other modern nations. But it really isn't all that exceptional.
I think one benefit of having this up here is it shows the hypocrisy in a nation who puts "in God we trust" on its
Yeah.
lines, and yet clearly does not adhere to the ideals of Christianity. People don't want to do this stuff.
No.
I wanted to just, to me, it feels it just describes a person, who's decent, tolerant, patient with other people, and yet, it's not taking. It's not walking through life unexamined, re-examined all you've been told at school, at church. It just seems like a really, maybe a Christian kind of a person, how ideally Christians supposed to be, I guess.
Well, given that he was attacked by the Christians in his day, and he thought they were all narrow-minded sectarians, he's thinking of that as a way of going against them. But you're right, there's a general feeling there. It's similar to a heavy Christian ethic.
This is the day for me to argue about Christianity. I had a heavy conversation this morning. I don't believe in God. I'm not a Christian. Does that mean I'm not an American? Walt Whitman was writing a poem. He didn't intend for you to
Now, this is
apart quite that
right.
much.
Yeah. This is actually a prose preface to the poem, but it's the same thing. Yeah.
Hi. What I'm seeing in all this is that some of these things are not necessarily Christian. I mean, they may be Christian, but they're also eternal values that different societies and cultures have.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many Eastern religions believe in taking care of those who are poor and loving the earth and sun and animals.
Yeah. Now, I didn't think of this as particularly, especially Christian.
Right. I mean, some of our discussion has surrounded that, and I'm just thinking many of these things are just human values.
Yeah. I think
very hard to put numbers onto.
Well, and to my mind, the American twist on it is the frontier, the open space. Let me just say a word about where we're going with all this, and then we'll come back to the discussion. Oh, go ahead.
I think a lot of this, we believe in it until we get to the point where we realize that means having to give up some of our own privileges.
Yeah.
It's privilege. You don't want to give your own up.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my point.
Yes.
Yeah, I just like to go back to the distinction between fairness and equality.
Mm-hmm.
but there's very different outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Quality.
Yeah, fairness is a very interesting category, because fairness with regard to what? And you're going to always get in that situation where there's no set of rules that will enable you to solve that. You're always going to have to make judgments. So what I've been doing today is trying to set up some suggestions about somewhat contentful, second level, more general principles that people could sign on to and say they're American, even though where they start from might be quite diverse. And that gets us to multiculturalism. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, last week. We're going to talk about some problems having to do with multiculturalism, both internal and external problems. And I'll cite one of them now, because there's an issue that groups, as well as individuals, get into multicultural situations. And the one I want to highlight is in the upper right corner there. There are problems with the limit of tolerance, right? I'm open to your values. You're signing on to my general values and the institutions that bring them out, the courts and things like that. But I know deep down that you're doing it only because you don't have the power to stop it. Right? What do you do in a multicultural society when some of the things you're supposed to respect would, if they could, eliminate the multicultural freedom? This is happening in Europe right now. Right? Maybe you could argue it's trying to happen here. If you look at Hungary, if you look at Poland, people have gotten in by democratic methods and then are trying to smash up the democratic system. Right? Been known to happen here too. That's a multicultural issue. Because the multicultural thing is on a two level, you can have your values which are not shared, but you'll sign on for tactical reasons to the upper values, because if you get into power that way, you'll annihilate it. Right? This is a known strategy. I use the word domination. There is a Christian group called dominationists who say that we should run according to the Bible. The sort of thing they're afraid of, Sharia law is going to come and get you. Well, they say, no, the Bible is going to come and get you. But that's just a mirror image. But they're actually, the tactic is to be tolerant and so on until you get into a situation where you can change the laws and then make everybody behave that way. Well, that's a danger of multiculturalism. And it's never going to go away because people will do that. And there's less extreme dangers having to do with respect and tolerance. And what John Rawls calls overlapping consensus. That is, we agree on those general values for different reasons. I do it because I believe it comes from Christ. You do it because you believe it comes from Buddha. Well, it's not a big deal. We still agree on the principles. But maybe we're having those different reasons we would disagree on some of the applications. As soon as you put this multi-level identity into a public space, you're going to get difference. And that's what we need to talk about next time. And the other thing we need to talk about is territory, right? The nation state. The easiest image you could have would be this. Well, each nation has its own principles, its own identity, and we don't interfere in anybody else's identity. And we enforce our own identity. And we're all happy, and occasionally we war with one another. That's the 19th century. We'll talk about Westphalia next time. The trouble is, it's not today. There's all these inconvenient others in our country. To really have that image, you'd have to do ethnic cleansing so that we all would agree. And then it would be very neat. There'd be the Catalans here, and the Scots there, and the Irish there, and so on. Each little group would be homogeneous, and a border and sovereign. It's lovely. except it ain't real. Right? It can't be real because we keep bumping up against the others. There's this thing called radio and the internet and the television. Our world is not that world of convenient borders and pure societies. Well, then what is it? Tune in next week.
Are you going to talk about the misinterpretation of dominion over the earth coming from the Bible?
We could do that, I don't know.
Because that always just irritates me.
It should.
The other thing is that we're in the Nietzsche class,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a discussion about the influence of Plato on Nietzsche. Can we talk about some of that in philosophy?
Yeah, bring it up.
Because, I don't know, I feel like it's ignorance being pushed around, and it doesn't feel good to me. I just like some clarification.
All right, well, let's try to do that. Yeah. I haven't been able to get to that class, but...
I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll bring this up next time. Is there ever any